with Archbishop Mark MacDonald. Mark, welcome. It's great to have you here. Before we move more deeply into introductions and the conversation, I just wanted to share a land acknowledgement about our presence here and our connection with the Indigenous presence on our land, on the land here, where the University of Toronto sits. We acknowledge that the land on which Trinity College and the University of Toronto operate is part of the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, an Anishinaabe people. Land covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. We acknowledge the stewardship of this land by First Nations, the continuing presence here of Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and the harm caused by colonialism. We commit ourselves to seeking a new and honorable relationship with the First Peoples of this land and with the land. Thank you. Well, I'd first like to thank our University of Toronto co-sponsors who helped make this event possible. These include the School of the Environment, the Masters of Science and Sustainability Management program based at our UTM campus, the Graduate Environmental Students Association, GESA, the Environmental Students Union, ENSU, and the Faculty of Divinity at Trinity College. So thank you all for your sponsorship of this event with us. Joining us tonight are special guests, Emiko Newman, and Emiko is president of GESA. And it's great to have you here, Emiko. Emiko is going to be helping us with the logistics as well this evening. And also, it's wonderful to welcome Chloe Kapanen. Welcome, Chloe. And Chloe is a fourth-year student who is the journal organizer for ENSU and an assistant in our Integrated Sustainability Initiative. Thank you, Emiko and Chloe, for all your help in making this possible. And we are, of course, deeply delighted to welcome Archbishop Mark MacDonald. Archbishop MacDonald has been very generous with his time and his insights and his wisdom over the years here at Trinity College and at the university and beyond. Archbishop MacDonald is the first National Indigenous Anglican Bishop and now Archbishop for the Anglican Church of Canada, as well as North American President of the World Council of Churches. Archbishop Mark MacDonald has published many works on multiculturalism and evangelism, sacred connections between faith and environment, and Indigenous youth ministries. In addition, Archbishop MacDonald led a wonderful ground blessing for the new Lawson Center for Sustainability that will be initiated on the campus of Trinity College. Mark, it's wonderful to welcome you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Yeah, it's great to be here with you. And Mark, just in opening, you have an amazing blending of Indigenous lifeways and worldviews and Christian Anglican worldviews and experience. And I was just wondering, how did this come to be? What were some of the salient moments in your life path that led to your current ministry in these areas?
Well, that's a longer story than you want to hear, but I'll do the high points. So I grew up in northern Minnesota. My family has Indigenous ancestry, but my father was the first person to go to college in his family, but he was an attorney, and his area, what he focused on was what we would now call Indigenous rights. And so from a very early time, I was spending a lot of time on what in the US are called reservations and with elders, and an elder lived with us for quite a while. But also my father was able, because of his own values, to teach me about the relationship of the people of the land and waters, the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, also known as Canada and the United States. And they were able to share, he was able to share with me things that were a foundation for what I would do later. So when I became a priest in the Episcopal Church, after studying in Toronto, my work was all with Indigenous people, and that shaped me very much, especially being with the Navajo people, who that's really my spiritual home, and my basic orientation. Although I also have spent much time with Anishinaabe elders and others across the land. But I was the Bishop of Alaska, and we got involved with the effort to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Mm-hmm. And I began to see there the intersection of Indigenous knowledge and the future of the planet, and more deeply and more urgently, the interconnection of Indigenous rights to a livable future for our planet. And so I began to see that on Turtle Island and in the Arctic, we are facing some of the most important issues of the future of our planet, and that this is so urgent and so little understood that was really critical. Now, to wrap it up with a bow, and I left out a whole bunch of interesting stuff, but I don't think anything really anything urgent. But when I became the National Indigenous Anglican Bishop, I was sick for a while, and I listened to tapes going back to 1988 of what the elders had said, preparing for my position. It started in 1988. It didn't come to fruit until 2007, and so I listened to these tapes, and among the things that they said an Indigenous bishop would do was that a national Indigenous bishop would also be a bishop for Mother Earth, and that bishop would advocate for the symbiotic relationship between the people of the land and the land, and that had to be, that was fundamental to their understanding both of their spiritual life, but also these things. And I began to see that there's certain kind of coherence to that in terms of the way Anglicanism saw things theoretically, as opposed to the way Anglicanism did things colonially. And so we didn't walk out mad. We didn't threaten to leave. We threatened to stay, and here we are. So,
well, I'm glad you came through with your threats and stayed. And this commitment to Mother Earth as part of, in a sense, your process of being made the first National Indigenous Archbishop is telling, because on the one hand, it's important that comes from Indigenous elders, but as religious groups, and particularly Christianity, are beginning to explore what is their relationship to creation and what is the vocation and indeed place of the human in the earth systems, in the cosmological picture. Yeah. This deepening of not only stewardship, but creation care and interrelationality is coming to the fore. And so I'm just wondering, in your movement over the past decades in this area, what are you seeing in terms of this recognition by non-Indigenous groups, by religious groups such as the Anglican Church and others, on this deep interconnection that we are sharing, both scientifically and culturally? And how is that expressing itself in your view?
That's a wonderful question, Stephen. Thank you. I mean, I have mixed feelings about it, so I have to start out in that way. I mean, on the one hand, it's very gratifying because I've seen change happen rather rapidly over time. On the other hand, there is a worry that it isn't fast enough, because I think that at the heart of the Indigenous insight about what creation is and where human beings are, is this idea that we are absolutely and completely interrelated, and that I think the most fundamental insight is that we don't exist apart from creation. And I think that it has become an intellectual habit for people to think of themselves as somehow separate. And I first realized this when working with, hardcore environmentalists. I mean, we're fire-breathing environmentalists, and they would say things like, it would just be horrible if we lost all of our wild places. And I would look at them and I'd say, you're not going to care. We won't exist in any way, shape, or form like we do now if there aren't any wild places. That's unless there's a huge change, we are in deep trouble. And there is a sense that you find from people is that we can kind of, well, I would. Here's my bias, that we can greed our way out of this problem, and I don't think it can happen apart from a spiritual revolution, at the heart of which is understanding that we are human because of the rest of creation, that we are not apart, we don't exist apart. If you took us away from all of this, we might have, oxygen being processed in our lungs and blood pumping, but we would be something quite a bit less than the human beings that we were intended to be, and what we are a fraction of now. And so I think that as this has grown in my mind, and as I've seen, various reactions to this, I'm very encouraged by the growing number of people who understand the urgency of a change in cosmology, and that it's not at all a trivial thing. It's not all, it's not poetic or romantic. It's not, it is essential to our future. But on the other hand, I am deeply disturbed at the urgency and the little window of time that we have for a revolution that has to be rather substantial and universal.
Yes, as you were speaking, it reminded me of the work of Thomas Berry, a cultural historian whose work, and I'm sure you are very familiar with him and his work. Yeah, and he would say that the universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects, and he used that to help critique the consumerist worldview too, that just saw the use and discarding of reality as kind of the main leitmotif of contemporary culture. And this notion too that we have to see ourselves as earthlings, that and then touching on Adama, Adam, of the soil, from the very roots of that word, and that we can't exist on Mars, or we won't be human on Mars. And so the kind of colonizing thinking that moves beyond planet Earth into other interstellar realities is this kind of disease thinking. And Thomas Berry would talk about a cultural pathology, that we were engaged in this cultural pathology.
Yes.
And I guess you've been kind of writing and speaking about something similar to that in terms of idea.
Yeah.
Mark, one time you were asked in one of the classes you kindly guest lectured in for me by a student, what has been your main challenge in your role as National Indigenous Archbishop? And I want to ask you that now, a couple of years hence from that first question, what has been the main challenge, and do you see as the main challenge in your role here, the most challenging aspect?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, and it's interrelated with the other things that we've been talking about, that there is the relationship of humanity to the rest of creation, and the relationship of the colonial governments that have kind of metastasized into the culture of money around the world. They are built upon assumptions that are mostly hidden from view. I mean, so if you came up and said to somebody, so do you think Indigenous people are primitive? They'd say, no. But so often what happens is that people automatically, because of embedded assumptions, assume that the best thing that can happen to Indigenous people is that they update themselves and become a part of the larger planet. I think that there is a built-in assumption in the relationship of colonial culture and what it has become. There is a built-in assumption that Indigenous people are a primitive form of us, and that with enough time, they'll end up in the suburbs too, at the pinnacle of human development, and with a barbecue and everything that speaks of civilization. And I'm sure they'll have barbecues, by the way. But anyway, but I think that this assumption, which is subtle and wicked and pervasive in so many ways, it is something that even when people say something nice about Indigenous people, it's as if we have to return to that kind of simplicity of thought, when in fact it is a rather complex set of thoughts. It is, and there are ways in which Indigenous culture is quite sophisticated. The World Council of Churches meets and gathers using a consensus method that they learned from Indigenous people in North America. It is one of the most difficult gatherings on the planet, and but
you mean there's been conflict among religions in the past, Mark?
Yeah, boy, could I tell you. Anyway, so these things, and they affect Indigenous people too. So we developed a way of life for those of us who are a part of the Indigenous sacred circle that is in the Anglican Church. And in it, we talked about how we were trying to see our faith embodied in Indigenous law and philosophy. And one of our folks, a person who had been an advocate and activist for decades, said, "Did we have law?" And so the idea that, you know, it was all loincloths and hiding behind bushes is pervasive and almost impossible to lead. So that is problematic in the work that we do, because people just, what? They cannot understand that you could be modern and indigenous. So it is that you could like the Beatles, or I guess that's not a modern example, but anyway, so and this is, I think, the single most wicked, I'd like to say demonic idea, because it's not only killing indigenous people, it's killing the planet.
Yes, that notion of wicked or demonic, for me, ties into the notion of structural sin and institutionalized violence. And today, March 24th, as you know, marks the 42nd anniversary of the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero, another archbishop in El Salvador. And he was killed while saying mass after standing up for human rights and preaching against the government's repression of his people. And he came, as you know, to kind of become emblematic of liberation theology as it was emerging from the global South. And those notions that liberation theologians brought to world attention about reading reality and scriptures through the prisms of the poor and adopting a preferential option for the marginalized became, of course, very controversial and very challenging. I was wondering, Mark, how the liberationist perspective may have influenced your own work and its continuing relevance, if that's there, in the kind of reconciliation work, justice work, and change in the environmental consciousness that we're talking about, might be.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Well, I was ordained shortly before Oscar Romero was assassinated, and he had been a hero to me. I was very much a part of the political activities related to what was going on at the time, and his death shaped my thought and feelings in a deep way. I still remember very clearly, as a very young clergy person, being allowed to shape the liturgy of a group of churches gathering together. It was really an important part of my life. I think that I have also, been certainly influenced by liberationist theology, and also more recently some of the indigenous voices coming out of Asia, who are really looking at multiple lenses to try to view that, one of which, of course, is a liberation theology aspect. And so it's still, I think, a vital part of who and what we are today. I think for indigenous people, we also have looked to people like Vine Deloria Jr. and others who really clarified for us that relationship of indigenous people to the land was essential, vital, and defining. So that in a way, we began to think of indigenous people as those people who had not severed the link to the land, which is, as we saw it, as I understood it from our elders, that link, which is, in order to be a part of the modern nation state, you have to sever that link. Mm-hmm. And the Indigenous refusal to do that is a defining aspect of Indigenous life around the globe. And we began to see a fellowship in that. And all of that, was related, I think, to that. But I think what happened at the same time was an evolution of understanding that our elders had agency in terms of how they received the Christian message, and that they had shaped it very much. For that reason, they were looked upon as failures by the church. And we began to listen to them as well, because they had a program that was a liberationist. They had a way of being that was true to Indigenous thought and over time, and they became really our guiding lights in terms of what we would do and how we would live. That's still true today, although many of the people that shaped our thinking are now gone to the world to come. But I think that all of these things are influences and important ones. And Indigenous, it's important. Indigenous thinking is four-directional, meaning that we're always trying to walk around a problem and an issue and to see it from a minimum of four sides. And I would say liberation theology is definitely one of the sides. Yeah.
Right. And as you were speaking, I was reminded of two things. One is the distinction that is often drawn between religious and spiritual in conversations with Indigenous activists, scholars, elders. And then also a story that you shared in an interview that's on YouTube. And it's when you talked about Joshua Georg Kohl, the German ethnologist who visited the Ojibwe in northern Wisconsin in 1855. And you were talking about how he noted that the greatest obstacle to Christianity among the Ojibwe was their charity.
Yeah. They were way too Christian to be Christian.
And how they were reflecting the acts, the acts of the apostles in terms of communal living, sharing, taking care of one another, eschewing private property to a certain extent. Yes, and that was considered an impediment to Christianity.
Yes. Yeah. Very much so. And I think that, the values of the elders, which I think I learned from a lot of people. One of the people was my father. His attitude towards property and what we owned was very, very, very much shaped me. I wish it had shaped me more. I think that you see this this strain, so that there is a sense that in Indigenous life that if we all share, there's going to be enough for everybody. If we don't share, there won't be enough for anybody. So these values, these ideals, the idea that we're in relationship, a familial relationship with humanity and with all the things of creation, these shape the way this life is, and that's the way of life that we wish to lead in the sacred circle. That's the way that we wish to lead with our relationship to the larger culture. But it's really it is difficult because it's hard to participate in the larger economy and not be influenced by its values, and not be forced to follow its values.
Yes, I remember being at the Copenhagen COP, the Kyoto, now Paris Accord conversations. And I was with the University of Toronto, and we were partnering with the Assembly of First Nations in some capacities there. And I was speaking to an Inuit lawyer who was with the Assembly of First Nations. And he was explaining to me that while the Inuit were at the table and talking about, forest futures, etc., their cosmologies were not welcome. In a sense, just what you're speaking about, this deep interrelationship. And it was almost if, the chessboard had been set. You're either going to play the game as we've outlined it or get out. You might as well get a piece of something. But when you start talking about this deeper metaphysical, ontological interconnection, you lose us, because we're talking about an economic reality here. So either play the game as we've set it or leave the table. That was what he was expressing to me at that time. Has that been kind of some of your experience?
Absolutely, absolutely. At a number of different levels. It's just, I think that, and this, who people are defined oftentimes by rather trivial outward signs. A traditional Indigenous person is someone who smudges, but in Indigenous life, smudging is a revered thing, but the values are more important. The cosmology is more important. The way in which you understand the relationship of spirit to matter, the way you understand how those things create life and create responsibility to life. All of those things are really important, and it's made Indigenous people feel like we're in a temporary alliance with environmentalists, but they'll throw us under the bus as soon as the conservatives would if we were doing with them. It's because there is a sense in which those values are not followed. So there's a huge fight going with the Sami people up in Sweden in what they call green colonialism. The way in which their lands have been impacted by measures towards climate change, but done without their consultation. And so these sorts of things are really critical. And also, I was at a meeting once in Washington, D.C., and there was a Blackfoot delegation there, and we were saying, why are you here? Well, they have a lot of these wine and cheese parties at these things, so you have to go to all of them and say hello. And we were there. This guy, he said, "What are you doing here?" I told him, and I said, "What are you here?" And he's doing, and we were with a conservation group. We were talking about the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and this Blackfoot guy, he said, "Yeah, we like these guys. They understand that if you plant a tree, you might have to cut it down someday." And his purpose was that sometimes, even on the environmental side, they would not understand the symphony of life, and that we were. It was that there was creating something for humanity and not understanding the reality of the interrelatedness of all things and the humble place that human beings have in the mix.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that notion of humility and humbleness, I think, is so important in what I'm hearing you say in terms of a cultural chauvinism or arrogance. There's one way to be fully human, and that does involve a suburban house with 2 cars and a barbecue.
Yeah.
And the humility to rethink that in relationship not only to the history of colonization and colonized persons, but the land itself. And over the years, I've had a sense that unless we really reconcile in a truthful way with Indigenous and colonized people, we're not going to reconcile fully with Mother Earth. That
Right.
this is a mutual moment of humility and transformation and metanoia. And
Yeah.
that seems to be some of your experience as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think. Thank you for that. That's important. I think that the Indigenous people, I think, have been an adjunct to most of these conversations, so that people will say, "Oh, yeah, and they have these ideas that would be helpful to us now," and also, we don't want to forget them and their rights, and that is kind of like an, oh yeah, we don't want to forget that. That's good. And I think that there's variations in estimates, but there's an estimate that up to a quarter of the world's remaining usable land is in the hands of Indigenous people in terms of their protocols and ways of doing things. As a footnote to that, I would say many nations do not recognize either that stewardship or sovereignty over those territories. So that's an important thing. And 85% of the world's remaining biodiversity is in the hands of Indigenous people. Now, what I think is critical for us to understand and I think proclaim to whoever will listen is that there is no livable future for our planet in which Indigenous rights are not respected. So that you can't say, oh yeah, we should do that too. Don't forget that. It is an essential component of a livable future, and that so much of the economy and culture that we have is based upon the massive theft of resources and human resources from the land and from resources, and what can you say about it other than it isn't sustainable? I mean, it's not going to last, folks. It's this is so obvious that you wonder what it's important not to poison your water. It's just all these things are so painfully obvious, but the deeper consequences of them are hardly available. So there's a big controversy in Africa now over the Okavango. It's a river area, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. We've been involved because the Indigenous people in that area have asked, through their bishop, have asked us for support, and we've done that. It's a Canadian company whose name's escaping me right at the moment that's proposing doing all sorts of mining in the area. Anyway, or extraction in the area. And what is significant is that you have the pro-development people and you have the environmental people. The environmental people, who I agree with, say this would be the destruction of one of the most important ecological areas left in Africa. It would be it's an insane proposal. However, neither the environmentalists nor the developmentalists recognize that what they call the Bushmen have been there and have been stewards over this area for generations and generations and generations, and there's still their sovereignty and stewardship over the land completely unrecognized by both sides. They don't have a say in this issue other than to be kind of poster children for what damage might happen. And this is the kind of issue that is going on everywhere, and in the Amazon and in the Arctic as well. We in Canada are facing that very much. So anyway, I think that it is a critical issue to the larger issues facing us, not just in the philosophical sense that Indigenous people have an insight into what's going on, but also they themselves are critical to the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it reminds me of the Hydro-Quebec development under the Bourassa government in the 70s, making the decisions to flood these amazing rivers in northern Quebec without even consulting the Cree and other Indigenous groups that were there, as if their stewardship and kind of relationship with the land was completely invisible.
I was for a short time an acting bishop over one of those areas, and I got to talk to elders, and they said, we had no idea that this was happening. We heard that the machines from a great distance, and then went to explore it, and then to find out that this was a loaded gun pointed at their head, and it's absolutely astonishing that and these were leaders of their people, and nobody knew what was going on. It's astonishing.
We were talking earlier about some ways where constructive dialogue with Indigenous knowledge and non-Indigenous knowledge can come together. And we were mentioning the new map that has been made for the Climate Atlas of Canada. And this one spearheaded by a number of Indigenous leaders, Brett Hooson being one of them, as well as Ian Moreau at the Prairie Climate Group there in Winnipeg, have just unveiled this amazing new climate map that incorporates wisdom, data, films from all 600 plus Indigenous communities and the Inuit communities of Canada and the Métis communities. And this is an interactive map of how climate change is affecting those communities, but also the wisdom and insights of the elders in those communities, of the scientists who are Indigenous in those communities, of citizen scientists in those communities. And it was just launched March 15th. And this to me seems like a hopeful development in terms of some of the things that we've been talking about, of a mutual listening and a blending. There's the notion of braiding sweetgrass that Robin Wall Kimmerer, the Indigenous scientist from upstate New York, talks about. This seems to be an example. And I was just going to ask you about that, about your view of this kind of development with the Climate Atlas, incorporating Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit worldviews.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. It is long overdue, and one of the hopeful signs of the future. And I think that there was not all the missionaries, not all the missionaries were bad, but there was one named Hudson Stuck, and he was from England. He lived for a while in Texas, and then he went to seminary in Tennessee, and then moved up to Alaska. And when he was there, he was a scientist on the side, and he published a number of books that dealt with issues of Arctic exploration from a scientific lens. But when he was there, he became convinced that Indigenous technology was superior to anything that you could find in the so-called civilized world. And he said civilization would be a fine thing if we knew what it was. So he a couple of days ago, it was the anniversary of the beginning of his trip to the top of what we call Mount Denali, sometimes known as Mount McKinley. And what he wanted to show was that Indigenous technology and know-how was superior to the trip had been tried by many, many people using the height of Western technology. And he wanted to show that Indigenous technology was superior. And he saw the capacity and wisdom of living on the land so critical, and he saw it as a inexcusable and deadly error for the colonial cultures to ignore that, and he said, he would say, what kind of stupidity would make someone wear cotton in the Arctic, and to say that it was bad to wear skins? He said, what kind of idiocy is this? And I think there have been people who have recognized and realized that there are aspects of life that Indigenous people were better at. So, for instance, the way in which Indigenous technology helped create wealth in Canada, those kinds of things. And so I find it hopeful that a broader group of people is recognizing that this is not only important knowledge, helpful knowledge, but perhaps even saving knowledge for our planet.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And at this point, we're going to segue, and I'm going to invite Chloe to ask some questions, and then we're going to open it up to the wider audience. And for our audience, you can put your questions in the Q&A section, and then we'll harvest those and share those with Mark. But Mark, I warned you I might have an attempt at humor before we go to do. So here's just an attempt at humor as we segue to the next part of the program that came to mind as we were talking. So it involves worldviews and love of nature. So there's an avowed atheist who loves nature, and he's hiking one spring morning out in Banff National Park. He's enjoying the bucolic splendor of this gorgeous day when he encounters a grizzly bear. The atheist freezes, the grizzly stops, and then the atheist panics and starts running through the forest at top speed, and the bear comes right after him. So for the first time in his life, the atheist starts to pray, God, are you there? And God said, yes, have we met? And he said, well, no, we've never talked, but could you help me? And God said, well, sure. What's the problem? Well, I'm being chased by this bear. And he said, well, what would you like me to do? And he said, well, because I've never believed in you, I've never prayed, I don't want to ask something too grand, but could you at least make this grizzly a God-fearing Christian? And God said, of course, it's done. And the grizzly stops, and the atheist stops, and the atheist is breathing these huge sighs of relief when he sees the grizzly bend his huge head and fold his gigantic paws and begin to pray, dear Lord, for the meal that I'm about to receive, make me truly grateful. We got to be careful what we pray for. Right? Oh, sorry about that. Okay. It's now my great pleasure to welcome Chloe to the conversation. And as mentioned, Chloe is a fourth-year student in environmental studies and other areas here at the University of Toronto. And she also is with the Environmental Students Union, coordinating their journal, and has been working with the Sustainability Initiative as one of our assistant interns. Moreover, Chloe did a summer-long research project on sustainability and the sacred, a project that my wife Hillary Cunningham and I are working on, and did remarkable work there. So Chloe, welcome, and so glad that you can join us and bring your questions to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Professor Scharper. I have to say that joke is a hard act to follow, so I hope my questions will suffice. Archbishop MacDonald, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Just so appreciative to be able to discuss these really important questions with you tonight. So my first question relates to the official side event for COP26 that the Anglican Communion had hosted in November of 2021. As Professor Scharper had addressed with previous COP meetings, that Indigenous communities were seemingly invited to the table for discussions, but their cosmologies were not. I was curious, how was the overall experience of co-hosting this event at COP26, and did you feel that this event sufficiently challenged the prioritization of capitalist conceptions of the environment over Indigenous cosmologies?
Well, the answer to that last question is no, but I'm sorry to say, but I think the COP gathering is probably a valid microcosm of where we are today. And I think I saw Indigenous issues and Indigenous people inch forward in that context. And yeah, I mean, people paid attention. Some of the things that we did were picked up by major newspapers here and there around the world, and they were obviously interested, and people there is a subtle reaction to it, that you could see in a lot of the booths and the propaganda that people had on both sides, that Indigenous people are in the they're in the mix. But I do not think that we are seeing an adoption of the kind of ideas and cosmologies that will make a huge, that will make the difference in this. And so, and I was frustrated because there were very slick efforts, some of the most expensive efforts at the COP gathering were towards making things that are very damaging look like they weren't. And so everybody, I watched this one film, and it was stunning. It was, I didn't know who until the end. I didn't know who it did it, and I can't remember why somebody sent it to me to watch. So it sounds like David Suzuki. It's just like we have the it's absolutely, we must do this, and so on and so forth. And then they get to the end, and then their solution is to build more pipelines for oil. It's and that's so overwhelmingly frustrating, and I think so. We saw things inch forward, and I this was the first time I'd been to a COP, but I know a lot of the folks involved from Indigenous side, and they seem to have a higher profile, and there were a lot of organizations like the Anglican Communion and like the World Council of Churches and other faith groups that saw the Indigenous voice as a critical one, and not just as, you know, these poor, miserable people, they're really suffering, but as that this is a primary issue of justice related to the future of our planet. And that you know, I have to confess, I never thought I would see the day that would happen. So am I grateful? Yeah, I'm really grateful. And I'm, you know, I give thanks to God that such a thing happened, but it's happening a lot slower than I think is necessary for our future. And by that future, I mean the Indigenous future. I would say one other thing. I hope it's not irrelevant, but you know, for many people, they look upon what happened to Indigenous people in a bad way as a historical event, regrettable. You know, it's too bad. And you know, if we had been there, certainly it never would have happened. You know, but for Indigenous people, the dislocation from the land is ongoing and in many respects accelerating because of climate disruption and climate injustice. These things are and the urgency, there is a sense of, you know, people patting themselves on the back. You know, we understand these things better, both Indigenous things and environmental things, and that's going to save us. It certainly isn't going to save us without ramping it up in a dramatic way. And I would say a spiritual revolution. By that, I don't mean everybody join my denomination. I mean a spiritual revolution in which people's minds and hearts are changed. And I think that that's going to happen across the board, and not just with Christian people or Indigenous people, or, you know, it has to happen to everybody. Yeah.
Yeah, and on that note, I guess this is a kind of unfair question to you, because there are still so many ongoing barriers to decolonizing understanding of the current environmental crisis and translating that into effective action. But I was curious, what do you foresee as some of the most significant barriers to making those necessary transformations, especially within this increasingly urgent timeframe?
Yeah. That's a fantastic question, Chloe. Thank you. So I think in both in the New Testament, but also in Indigenous stories, and I would say more so in the Hebrew scriptures, there's stories about the ways in which communities of people can be hypnotized into a way of thought that is destructive to themselves and to the environment around them. And so these ways of thinking, which are communal in nature, are very slippery, and especially in the colonial mentality, the autonomy of the individual keeps people from seeing that we have a communal problem, in the sense that we have been hypnotized by money, by power, by fame, by all sorts of things, by luxury, by the way, you know, I don't think all of these things are bad, but what's bad is when they become more important than humanity, when they become more important than the integrity of the environment. Whenever that happens, you are violating, from an Indigenous perspective, the great law of life, that all life is responsible to all the rest of life. That's the number one rule. And so the Christian tradition, I think, because it was it was easier to get along with rulers if you did this, they focused on, you know, whether I was thinking in a bad way or whether I was thinking and doing a bad way. So, it was all individual. Sin was, something that I came up with. Whereas I think the religious traditions of Indigenous people, I think a lot of other ones, say that the most difficult and painful things that happen when a whole group of people become beguiled is a word that's usually a word used for individuals, but when a whole community becomes beguiled, and then it's always, especially in the Old Testament, it's always a misuse of creation. It's always a misuse. It's an overvaluation of things relative to spirit. It's always this sort of thing. And in the Indigenous stories, they really focus on the communal beguilement that leads to pain and misery. And so I think that we have to speak prophetically to that, I would say, a soul sickness that we have. And again, the problem isn't, we have to have more people believe the right things. The problem is a question of values, a question of deception, and a communal one. And the rabbis all said, the worst sins are the sins that we do as a community, because communities can do things that someone would never do individually. So, I see all sorts of people who are meticulous about their personal environment and the way they keep it in balance, but then don't mind that we're leveling mountains and destroying rivers, and so these things I think are, from a spiritual point of view, a sign of soul sickness, and that's what I see as the huge, and I think it's killing the planet. I think it's killing Indigenous people.
It's really great to be in these spaces, and I find oftentimes as an environmental student, when I leave, I am confronted by the conversations that I'm having with other people and the difficulties in trying to convey the environmental crisis and the roots of our spiritual crisis. I guess the first question is, what tips would you give to environmental students who are trying to take these teachings and engage in these conversations with broader audiences? And moreover, do you think that religion can play a unique role in providing the tools to do so? And how do you do that in conversation?
Those are good questions, Chloe. I think that what Rabbi Abraham Heschel, he said that what prophets do is they give people insight into what's going wrong. And I think that again, in modern times, it's been more, like you bad person, you're thinking bad thoughts, and not addressing this kind of thing, this massive problem. And I believe that we have to find the ways to let people see and imagine what's happening and what's going on. And at a certain level, I think that Indigenous knowledge helps people to see things from a different perspective, and then say, "Oh, yeah, we could think this way," or ways in which people can see that the path that they're on, that they personally contribute to, ends in disaster, worse than disaster. Makes disaster look like a good thing. So I think that's important. But I also think that religious groups have a special role to play in this, and will bear a special responsibility if we don't do it in time. Because we are supposed to speak to people about how to live a better way of life, how to walk in a better way. And I think if religious groups are silent, if they don't talk about the attitudes and behaviors that lead to this, all of which is hostile to their shared values and ideals, I think it'd be a real trouble. But the good thing is that we have thousands of years of experience of saying, now here's a picture of something, and helping people to see how things could be better. And yeah, so I'm hopeful that could happen. But like I say, I think that religious organizations will bear a particular responsibility if this fails.
On that note, and I don't want to take up too much time because I do see that there's questions coming in from the audience, but I am curious, have there been any tensions within the Anglican community in conversations about this and questions of how to interpret and go forth in this? And have you?
Oh no!
Internal disputes and
you silly woman, you are you kidding? No. It's horrible. It's just horrible. And I think that and it's hard to get people to listen. I still bear the scars of being involved in discussions in Alaska, a famously pro-development state, and there was tremendous pressure brought to bear on me not to even think the way I thought. And people get really, really nasty about these things, and it's horrible. And I think that there is a sense in which in religious groups, if you are following a way of life that leads you towards destruction, and you're betting on the basis of your own greed that it won't be so bad. To have somebody say it's going to be bad really, really upsets people, and it's so bizarre. Like over this, over these decades that I've been involved in this, people get really angry, and they'll call me and they'll write me and they'll accuse me of all kinds of bizarre motivations and that sort of thing. And then, we'll at the drop of a dime, they'll turn around and say, well, I really respect what you're doing. Like, well, why are you killing me then? So we're in these things, and everybody should understand that when you touch these things, you're touching things that really hurt people. And we have to have some compassion for that. We have to understand that people who are well-intentioned and otherwise kind and good hold things that dear that are probably destructive in the long run. And so I think that we have to have compassion and humility in the face of that as well. But it is difficult, and I think part of the reason that religious groups stay away from it is it causes really some, food fights. As I didn't make this up. A friend of mine said it. That it's these discussions are like a duel in the dark with chainsaws. People are not they're not paying attention to the rules of debate when they talk about this. So yeah, I said more than you probably wanted to hear, but yeah.
No, I'm so incredibly appreciative of this conversation and all the insights you have. I'm curious, are there rules for debate? And how do you, this is a question that's been coming up a lot in, especially within religious feminist work, in a variety of traditions, is how do we conceive of tradition? Is tradition something that is inherently of the past, or is it something that can change and adapt? Does tradition have not one interpretation, but multiple? And which side might you find yourself on? And do you find that maybe other people have a singular interpretation, and that's maybe what's causing this?
Well, as I said earlier, Indigenous people picture truth as something like a mountain. And this mountain is so much bigger than a human being to comprehend. It's there. It's obviously there, but in order to understand it, you have to walk around it and to see it from a minimum of 4 directions, to be able to say, well, I've seen this. And even when you say that, you recognize that there are inherent gaps in your capacity to understand and see these things in a good way. That doesn't mean you aren't, you don't say, well, I don't know that the mountain's really there. You know that it's there. And so I think our elders tell us, believe with passion, believe with enough passion that you'd be willing to die for it, but make sure that you're never willing to kill for it. And that is, I think, the kind of attitude that is really necessary today to see things change and to be better. I would say that what happens, remember I said, I talked about people who are beguiled, and so for example, there's a crusader hacking off the heads of Muslim soldiers, worried about whether he's lusting after a woman in his heart. I mean, that to me is an example of the idiocy that these ways of thinking can be. That's just a small example. But what happens is that people get to a point where, and for me, when I studied theology, it was all about why we don't do what Jesus said we should do. It was painfully obvious that we had found a way to get around all of that stuff. And for me, the elders allowed me to see levels of it that I had never seen before. And so I saw trajectories of hope and life that I had never seen before. This, I think, is an important aspect of culture. So when we look at these things, we need to see them. So religious truth grows as it is translated into people's lives. And so, for instance, Navajo culture, which is very important to me, is matrilocal, matrilineal, and matriarchal. And when you read religious texts from that point of view, it changes how you see things. You see bias that becomes obvious, and you see truth that was suppressed. And so I'm not real confident of our ability to make up something new, but I am confident in our capacity to unearth the truth that has been hidden by greed, by patriarchy, by colonialism, by all of these things which have suppressed. So I'm not big on the idea that modern society is smarter than other people, but I do believe that humanity has a tremendous capacity to see the truth, to find a livable future in our past, and that has to be we are not going to be saved unless all of us are saved, and that is I think the absolute truth. So I feel a special kind of affinity for those people who are critiquing our foundational texts and the interpretations of them, but at the same time, I would say what's helped me to see that when the elders look at those sayings of Jesus, they in my tradition, they say, well, this is what he means, and oftentimes it's a biting critique of the way Western colonial theology has interpreted those texts. So I hope that makes sense at some level. I'm just saying amen. I should have just said amen. And then...
Yes, absolutely. That makes so much sense. I think it's really important, especially in dialogue, when people discuss, especially Lynn White Jr.'s piece, the roots of our ecological crisis. Are we conflating tradition and religion with coloniality, or is the structure of religion distinct from a faith? And I think that these are all really important discussions. I feel as though I've taken up so much time. Thank you so much for answering my questions. And Professor Scharper, if you wanted to take it to the Q&A.
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you for that rich interchange, Chloe and Mark. And we do have a couple of questions. So I'll share the first one, Mark. This is Stu Ball writing. As a youth, mostly as a Wolf Cub, a Boy Scout, and a Rover Scout, I was blessed to attend many events in the wilderness, both in Canada and abroad. I now have 3 grandsons, aged 31, 21, and 11, who have rarely, if ever, had that experience, and hence not had the opportunity to become closer to nature. Is this representative of our non-Indigenous urban youth today? Can this deprivation become part of reconciliation?
Yeah. That's a very good question. I think that Indigenous youth in the urban environment have a special danger of being captivated by those ways of thinking. Certainly they do. Going out on the land is really important. A lot of the elders say we have to, in order to be healed, you have to go out on the land. And they see, like in the stories of the great religious traditions, and especially stories about Jesus, that going out on the land was a part of finding balance and purpose and moving forward. And so I think there is a sense in which what I described earlier as this idea that human beings can be human apart from the rest of creation. This gets embodied in the way that people live. And I think it's destructive to our mental health as well as being destructive to our communal sense. And I think that it's necessary for all young people to have a new way of understanding the land. To if I could tell stories, I'll try to be quick. So I brought a Navajo elder to St. Paul, Minnesota, where the Minnesota and the Mississippi come together. And it used to be stockyards. It used to be like, and you can see the destruction of overdevelopment and all everywhere. And I said to the elder, what do you think? As we looked out across on these rivers and the cars going everywhere, I thought I was going to get a moment, of elder clarity. And he said, "Oh, it's beautiful." I said, "What?" I mean, this is a guy who's lived on the land all his life. He said, "It's beautiful." He said, and then he explained to me that wherever two rivers come together, it's a sacred place, and that was what produced this community. And he said, "Look at all these people. They're going to and fro. They're taking care of their families. They're doing all this." And he said, "I even understand that there's a big mall here that people come to from around the world." I just thought, "Oh no!" But his what he was trying to say to those of us who are living in urban environments is there's a reason why they work, and it isn't just because human beings are pushing paper across desks. There's a reason why they work. And what he was uncovering and unveiling is the environmental reason that Minneapolis St. Paul is there, why it's there. And I think if you looked at Toronto, you'd see the same thing, that there's environmental factors that make it happen. And so part of what we do is not just to get people out of doors, but for them to understand the relationship to human development and the land upon which they live. So I think that's important. That last thing I'll say, when I lived in north of Bemidji, Minnesota, on the Red Lake Reservation, we had a group of young people from the urban area come up, and we were going to go on a canoe trip, and I brought a young Ojibwe boy with me, and we paddled the canoe. And so we were paddling, we got out there, and they were all excited, and they were paddling away, and there was this there were poplars that were quite tall on both sides, and the sun was filtering it. It looked like it was just spectacular, and the water was kind of smooth, and we were just kind of inching down, and we got out there, and he and we stopped, and we put our paddles across the canoe, and we were just quiet. We were breathing it in, and you could hear the wind going through the leaves, and we were just overcome by it. And the kids in front of us started singing 100 bottles of beer on the wall, 100 bottles of beer. And you could see that for them, this was a place to let loose, We can just, we can do whatever we want, let's drink beer. So with bringing people out on the land, I think we have to reorient their relationship to the land. And that begins where they are, to see where they are as sacred, and not just the sacred is someplace that, is out somewhere. All of it is sacred. All of it is holy. and we must treat it all in that way.
Very nice. Thank you, Mark. And we have a second question from Bob Betson. Archbishop Mark, how do you respond to divide and conquer tactics, which seem to be the order of the day for pipeline companies and governments enlisting band council support with the promise of jobs and economic development?
Yeah, but it isn't the first time I heard that one, but so yeah, it's a real problem. It's a real the Oglala Lakota people have a huge amount of money, billions and billions of dollars in a bank that was put there as a settlement for the Black Hills. The Pine Ridge Reservation, which is most directly affected, they have the poorest county in the United States is where Pine Ridge is, and they're in a lot of misery because of poverty and poverty from colonialism, and they basically said politely to the government, keep your damn money. It isn't for sale, and we're not getting paid for it. And so that's where Indigenous people are. What happens, however, is that they are put in this ridiculous situation where in order to feed your children, you have to destroy your life. And I've seen many friends be caught in a situation where they're doing something that they fundamentally disagree with, but they have to do it in order to feed their children. And I think a government and companies that put people in that kind of situation are evil. Whether they mean to be evil or not, I don't care. It's just evil to not allow people to live with the dignity they deserve as human beings, much less as the first people of the land. That's atrocious. And so what you see happening is that people leverage these things. The politicians do, the environmentalists do, everybody does. They leverage these things, and oftentimes Indigenous people are caught in this mess. So, and it's multifaceted in the sense that oftentimes you're dealing with Indigenous issues that aren't well understood. So, like in the Wet'suwet'en issue, people say, well, what, the democratically elected people said, okay, what, I thought we were for democracy. And then we have to say, no, you don't understand. The elders are a form of democracy too. And one is imposed and the other one isn't. So these things are really, really difficult to help people understand. The other thing that happens, the commodification of politics and information has had a damaging effect on our capacity to understand and approach things, right? So, the standard of truth in politics for many, many decades now has been whatever sells is true. And unfortunately, in these kinds of issues, the way in which they're discussed and the way in which they're outlined is infected by that. And also, what I found is that the writer Arundhati Roy talked about this. She said, because of the way things are reported, which is based on what is going to be interesting to people, what is going to sell more. We used to say ink. I don't know what we say now, but anyway, more clicks, I guess. And she said, so what happens? You start with an ethical base, and then as it hits the media, it becomes like a hot air balloon that drifts away from its ethical base, so that you don't even remember what people were fighting about. And I found that reporters, and they're good people, I like them, would before they talked to me, they had the story written, and so in my case, wacko leftist bishops is, stands with the Gwichin or something like that, and they would manipulate words and stuff like that. I don't think they did it consciously, but they had a story in their mind before they talked to me, and then they, used my words so that they would get the things that they want, and and Bishop cares about all of his people, even those who disagree. That doesn't sell papers or anything like that. So we kind of demonize everybody in order to do that. And so these things, what I find is that 5% on one side are strident, 5% on the other side are strident. The rest of us are kind of in the middle, saying, I'm trying to figure out a way to live in a good way, and to be compassionate about other people. Anyway, so I guess you pushed a button, and I just talked. Yeah.
Oh, that's very rich, Mark. Thank you. I see our time is now drawing to a close. And in closing, before thanking you formally, Mark, I've invited Chloe to read a poem, and this is from Lenore Kishig. And Lenore is an Indigenous Anishinaabe poet who you may probably know from the Saugeen Peninsula, Bruce Peninsula, in Nehemiah, formerly known as Cape Croker. And she has shared this with my class in the past and other groups that we've invited her to speak at. And so, Chloe, I was just going to invite you to read the poem Song for the Trees.
I hope I can do it half the justice. Okay. Yeah. Song for the trees. I sing to the trees. I dance with the trees. In dreams, in dreams. In dreams I sing. In dreams I dance. Northwest I face. Northwest. Leaves spread before me. Northwest I face. Northwest. Leaves wave before me. In dreams I dance. In dreams I sing to the trees. I sing to the trees. In dreams, in dreams. I dance with the trees. In dreams, in dreams. In dreams, in dreams. In dreams I sing. In dreams I dance. In dreams, in dreams. Aya'i, aya'i, yeah. By Lenore Kishig. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe. Yeah. And thank you, Mark, again, for sharing so much of your story, your struggles, your insights, your hopes, and your wonderful spirit, the charity and vision melding and braiding wonderfully in your words. So thank you for being with us today and this evening. And thank you, Chloe, for all of your help, and to all of our sponsors. Thank you so much, Amico, and for the GESA support and your logistical support. And just want to remind our audience that next week will be our second Sustaining Conversations. As they used to say, same bat time, same, maybe a different channel, 7 o'clock Thursday. And we're inviting to join us, Linda McQuaig, Toronto Star columnist, and a woman who brings political economy to her books and her reflections on climate change. So we'll be discussing some of these issues from her perspective next week. Thank you all for joining us. Blessings on you all, and hope to see you next time. Thank you. Peace. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye now.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Good night, all. Thank you.
Good night.